The Negombo Muslim Women's Association was established in 1979 with the vision to educate, encourage, and assist the Muslims to live in accordance with the principles and precepts of Islam and to work for its advancement. I would like to take a moment to recognize and honor the visionary behind our association, founders of Negombo Muslim Women's Associations are A.R.M. Jabir Hajiar and Hajiani Ruzia Jabir. It was through their dedication, hard work, and unwavering commitment that the Negombo Muslim Women's Association was established, providing a strong platform for empowering and uplifting women in our community. From the very beginning, their goal was not only to nurture creativity but also to foster independence, skills development, and unity among us. Today's exhibition is a reflection of their vision, and we are grateful for the foundation they have laid for us. The first inaugural committee meeting of the association was conducted to select office bearers on 24th February 1980, electing Mrs. M. A. Rahima as the president and Mrs. Ruzia Jabir as the vice president, Mrs. Falila Muhammad as secretary, Mrs. Hamza Maharoof as a treasurer, Mrs. Bin Hassan and Mrs. M. T. Abdullah as the patrons, finally Mrs. Razik as the auditor. The Negombo Muslim Women's Association started conducting vocational classes, namely cookery and swing, from 1980. After completing the classes, an exhibition was held in 1981 to showcase the talents of the students. Mrs. Roji Farooq was the swing teacher at that time. In 1980, the association also started distributing Idda Fund. Al-Azhar Islamic Nursery was commenced on 10th of January 1979 by the Aminul Islam Association with 25 kids and Mrs. Fariha Anwar as the teacher of the Aminul Islam Cultural Center. Al-Azhar Islamic Nursery was later handed over to Negombo Muslim Women's Association in 1981. By the year 1982, the Negombo Muslim Women's Association started conducting scientific swing, knitting, and batik flower making classes too. Al-Azhar Islamic Nursery School shifted to Al-Haj Jabir Memorial Building in 1983. An exhibition was held in grand scale. This marks the remarkable success of the Negombo Muslim Women's Association. The annual general meeting for the year 1982 was held on 26th of March, electing Mrs. Ruzia Jabir as the president, Mrs. Zarina Halauddin as the secretary, and Mrs. Masuda Farooq as the treasurer. Mrs. Fariha Anwar performed duties as the principal of Al-Azhar Islamic Nursery from 1979 to 1984. Mrs. Ananda Appa and Mrs. Fernando took responsibilities of the nursery from 1984 to 1986. Mrs. Mazaima Farooq was appointed as the principal and treasurer of Al-Azhar Islamic Nursery from the year 1986 to 2003. Since 2003, Mrs. Mazaima is serving as the principal of the nursery and the treasurer of the association. Recently, Mrs. Ruwina Kamaldeen was appointed as the vice principal. Presently, the Negombo Muslim Women's Association is serving to uplift the lifestyle of our Muslim community. We are honored to introduce our dedicated executive members and members who have been the backbone to our organization. Their hard work and commitment have helped us to grow and serve our community. Al-Haj Ramis, Al-Haj Ikram, and Mr. Mushfiq are the patrons of this association respectively. Mrs. Rizmia Ramis, President, Mrs. Riazi Ruzaik, Vice President, Mrs. Riaza Nawaz, Acting President, Mrs. Fariha Anwar, Secretary, Mrs. Irfana Faumi, Assistant Secretary, Mrs. Mazaima Khan, Treasurer, Mrs. Rikaza Ikram, Assistant Treasurer, Mrs. Nuska Anam, Auditor, are the executive members of our association. The members of the Negombo Muslim Women's Associations are Mrs. Shifana Fariz, Mrs. Faiza Farid, Mrs. Nazrin Zahran, Mrs. Safia Siraj, Mrs. Fatima Faumi, Mrs. Hasina Halil, Mrs. Azmia Nalim, Mrs. Rizana Inham, Mrs. Rizfa Tasim, Mrs. Yasmin Nizamdeen, Mrs. Shamila Ashraf, Mrs. Shihara Ashraf, and Mrs. Farwin Muhammad. The Negombo Muslim Women's Association has started